Much of today's contemporary music and pop culture in the United States, it can be traced back to Black and Indigenous musicians. However, their contributions have long gone unrecognized, and their songs have often been commodified for a majority white audience. So how are musicians today working to undo that historical erasure? And how do they continue to celebrate Black performance and artistry? Earlier, I spoke to Jake Blount, an award-winning musician and scholar specializing in the early folk music of Black Americans, and Mark Anthony Neal, distinguished professor of African and African American Studies at Duke University, and the author of several books, including Black Ephemera, The Crisis and Challenge of the Musical Archive, for this week's UpFront. Jake, Mark, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront. Jake, I want to start with you. You describe yourself as a performer of traditional Black music and a specialist in the early folk music of Black Americans. You often talk about the profound ways that Black people have shaped and even defined roots music and Americana itself. But to many people, the contributions of Black folk and Indigenous folk seems to be lost to history. Can you talk about why it's so important for you to highlight the impact of this sort of appropriation and cultural whitewashing?
I think for me, the main reason is because it's all still ongoing. I think it's really easy to go listen to stories about the early record industry, about the way that early country music took shape, hear the ways that Black people and Indigenous people were kind of boxed out of the early commercial opportunities that were available in that, and lose sight of the fact that the same logic informs how many of the larger labels today, many of the publicists today, are choosing the artists that they work with, right? We're still having trouble finding space for Black people, for Indigenous people, for women to get the radio play, to get the industry access that particularly straight white men are able to have in country and Americana and related industries.
Absolutely. Mark, in your work, you also talk about the erasure of Black people's cultural contributions in the United States. And it's not just folk music where we see this stuff happening. Can you walk us through a little bit how other Black genres and other forms of Black music got commodified, even as its origins were sort of willfully forgotten?
The best example of this, of course, is rock and roll music. We forget about some of the early influences, right? Folks like Sister Rosetta Tharpe, who was ostensibly a gospel singer, but she played a guitar, right? And played in jazz clubs. We forget about even someone like Ike Turner, who helped create a really, influential song called Rocket 69, which is, foundational to the sound of what we call rock and roll. And the practices that went on in the 1950s, it just was every day that a Black artist would do what we would call a rhythm and blues song in that period of time that would get covered by a white artist and be promoted as something absolutely different. The most famous case of that, of course, is Hound Dog, right? Everybody, if they know an Elvis Presley song, they know Hound Dog, right? Most folks don't know that Big Mama Thornton recorded it 2 years before Elvis Presley. And even as he became the king of rock and roll, someone like Big Mama Thornton was erased from history. Pat Boone's almost whole musical career, at least in the 1950s, was predicated on covering Little Richard songs. And when you listen to Little Richard sing Tutti Frutti, which has a certain kind of resonance that we all recognize, if you've been raised in the Black church and Black blues spaces and rhythm and blues and what have you, and then you listen to Pat Boone sing Tutti Frutti, and it's like, what is this? Right. It is, you're hearing a literal whitewashing of Black music when you hear Pat Boone sing Tutti Frutti.
Mark, a lot of times people talk about Black music as the struggle. They talk about Black music as a music of pain and suffering and struggle. And it absolutely is, because we had to make a way out of no way, right? But it's also about joy. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how this tradition is not just a tradition of pain and suffering?
You use something like blues music, right? And for the average person, you hear blues music, and that's a bunch of mournful, sorrowful, sad Black people singing about stuff. And shout out to Angela Davis, because this is a part of what she talked about in her book, Blues Legacies. But you go to these Black women blues singers of the 1920s, they're talking about everything. They're offering social justice commentary, but they're also talking about sexual desire, both, heterosexual sexual desire and same-sex sexual desire in many of these songs that they're singing. And it's so much more than that, right? It is Black music specifically, right, is an exploration of the Black social, cultural, and spiritual condition. It's like, Baraka says, the late Leroy Jones, the late Amiri Baraka says, in blues people, right? That great line, the spirits do not descend without music. And that very much captures what Black music is. And again, there's a moment where Black music is seen as entertainment and commodity. And that's important because, musicians need to be able to make a living, right? But it's more than that, right? It is more than just entertainment, right? It is the life force of Black people being expressed in a musical context.
Jake, now, in your work, you've talked about sort of how in moments of despair, even in your own despair about anti-Black violence, against state violence, all these things, you've had to turn to the music of our ancestors. Traditional Black music remains a way, you say, of how they survived. First of all, what does traditional Black music mean to you?
I choose to use the term traditional Black music because it's expansive.
Okay.
When we talk about traditional music, oftentimes in a folk music context, it comes very specifically with, like, I play fiddle tunes or I sing sea shanties, that kind of thing.
Right.
And when I say traditional Black folk music, I think oftentimes people who are in the know will go to the banjo, or
right.
people will think blues guitar, and I love those things and I do those things, but I also think that any real definition of traditional Black folk music would have to include hip hop. It would have to include punk. It would have to include disco. There are so many other things that I think fall under that term.
Ain't nobody throwing Bad Brains in when they're thinking about traditional music.
Exactly, but when I'm thinking about that, if I'm talking about folk music, community music, traditional music that emerged out of us wanting to do something together rather than us wanting to sell something. And I think that creates a very different type of artistic product in the end. When I was growing up, we weren't playing banjos in high school, Limitless respect for the cultural role of the banjo in that music. Indeed. I play it and I love it, but, that's not what was going on around me, right? People weren't dancing to that.
Right, banjos weren't hot in the street.
Exactly.
So, Mark, you've talked about the depiction of Black people, particularly in the music industry, and also this legacy of minstrelsy and the minstrel show. When you look at the repackaging of Black identity and Black performance in bits and pieces for white profit, white entertainment, how do you see the legacy of minstrel shows playing out in the current moment, in the current era?
The way that we talk about minstrels is complicated, right? Because, on the one hand, we need to make a distinction between minstrels and blackface minstrelsy, right? These folks who literally blackened up as white folks to look Black and performed some variation of what they thought was Blackness. But then when you get to that era of folks like George Walker and Burt Williams and Ernest T. Hogan, right, who understand the limits of what they can do as musicians and songwriters. And so Ernest T. Hogan might write a song like, and this is the truth, right? He wrote a song called All Look Alike to Me. It's a Black man writing a song in the 1890s, called All Look Alike to Me, that was primarily consumed by white audiences, right? Sheet music, right? Playing the song in their homes, on their pianos, et cetera, et cetera. He understood what the market was at the time and the hunger, appetite, if you will, for white folks for what they deemed as authentic Blackness. Right, whether it was or not, right? And this is part of the game that we see in the 1990s with gangster rap. I have no doubt in my mind when we think about the primary figures of what gets identified as gangster rap, understood that they were packaging something for white mainstream consumption, right, that didn't necessarily reflect who they were. We know they weren't. It didn't reflect who they were, right? O'Shea Jackson came from a two-parented household, right? Snoop Dogg came from a two-parented, like all the kind of stereotypes and mythologies about Black pathology, right, that was embedded in gangster rap in the 1990s, they understood that they were delivering this to white consumers for profit. It doesn't mean that there wasn't some truth in that. The critiques of police brutality were very much real in the context of all that, but it's complicated, right? It's never going to be one thing, right? You're giving something to the market in order to make a living that the white consumers will consume, and at the same time, you're hoping that Black audiences hear the lower frequencies of what you're delivering for something that's more liberatory and sustaining and spiritual in that context.
Jake, I see you co-signing over there.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited that went where it did. Thank
you. As we're thinking about the power of our work as Black folk, and the power of cultural production to create change, whether it's the critiques of police brutality or state violence or Black on Black crime, whatever the thing might be, I'm also thinking about reparations.
Yeah.
Your first record is called not coincidentally, reparations.
Yes.
When we think about the future of black music making, how do you think we can apply reparations, right? And for those out there, I'm talking about compensation for the unpaid labor and systemic exploitation that black people have been forced to render since the beginning of slavery, right? How do we think about it in the context of the music industry?
So I talk about this a lot whenever we wind up having the conversation about cultural appropriation, which is this huge hot term right now that I think a lot of people hear but maybe don't understand the concept behind it. One of the things that I typically point to when we're talking about black music is how, whether it's rock and roll or minstrelsy or hip hop or disco or jazz, whatever, all of America's major musical exports have come out of the black community, right? Our music industry is built on the contributions of black people. Look at the financial breakdown of where that money is going after it's being made, right? Black people are producing the content, right? We're doing the intellectual and the spiritual and artistic labor to create these genres, and somebody else is making all the money. And that to me is a problem. And I think reparations is a big systemic conversation that needs to happen, and I'm well aware of the many people who don't want that watered down by talking about it in anything less than a context of government payouts for services rendered.
I probably would lean on that side.
Well, exactly. And that's what I think on an individual level, there is absolutely more that artists can do. And, you know, I'm fortunate to work with and know a lot of white musicians who go out of their way because they understand that they owe a debt. Right. And I think it would be nice in those moments where things get out of hand for us, right? I think a lot of people thought about this during the George Floyd uprisings a few years ago. You know, where are all of the rich white people who are in the entertainment industry, who have these massive followings, who have huge platforms, who have built their careers in themselves based on our work and then are not showing up when we need the support? And certainly, I think when you're talking about reparations, yeah, there needs to be a check. There needs to be money, right? Someone has done labor and there needs to be compensation for the labor. I also think as a performer, one of the most meaningful things available to me is not just my own personal resources, because I know for a lot of performers, even on a high level, oftentimes those aren't as high as they appear to people on the outside, right? All those people have a lot of people working for them, but I also think they have the power to motivate a huge group of people who also owe a debt because they enjoy all of the music. And it would be great to see more buy-in, absolutely, from, you know, those A-list celebrities who've built an empire with our bricks. And
Indeed. Jake, Mark, I want to thank you so much for joining me on UpFront.
Oh, thank you, Mark.